So one of the biggest problems that I encounter with most amateur golfers is in the start of the downswing. And what we are trying to do in the start of the downswing is we need to kind of navigate both rotational and linear motion, right? So rotational motion is, rotation around the spine, and linear motion is a movement purely from, shall we say, left to right. Now, the big reason why I would say most golfers that I sort of meet, whether that's online or people that come through that door for lessons, are struggling in the downswing, admittedly, is because things like the posture in the backswing are normally miles off. But I do encounter a lot of golfers that will say, Russ, I watched some of your videos on the downswing and they're trying to do something like this where they're trying to trigger a rotation and struggling in a big way. Now, what we've got to try and do is we've got to try and think about the golf swing, not so much in this video on a position basis, so we're not talking about where the wrist should be and position or where exactly we're trying to be. You're trying to do this video based upon what it should feel like, okay? Now, what we want to do is in this backswing position, we need to turn, so we're creating an element of resistance under the trail side, so we can then use that trail side to help us open up the lower body coming into the downswing. So, the first drill that I want you to do, we've got two drills in this video, okay? One of them you've seen before, and this is something that I do with a lot of my students, and you guys can do this in the form of one of two ways, okay? So one of the ways in which you can do it, Callaway Golf sell a foot wedge, and this is a Wedge Pro, but you guys can get creative. The foot wedge works perfectly well. The Wedge Pro is a great training aid, but I don't know logistically whether you guys can get hold of one. But I've talked about this sort of thing a lot, and I do it a lot with my students. The idea of a foot wedge is it does two things. One, it tilts the foot, okay? So it sort of pronates the foot like so it gives you more of a platform to turn into. And the second thing it does is, because it raises the leg up, it keeps it more flexed. So again, it sort of subconsciously makes you think more about pushing in towards the ground. Now, the other way in which we're going to do this is we're going to try and get a sense of internal hip rotation. So you're going to bring your trail leg in front of you and then just turn inward, okay? And then just turn. Okay, just focus on your rotation. And what you should do when you do this is you should get an activation in your glute. And this would be an indication that you've got the correct hip rotation in the backswing position, in terms of we're really sort of feeling like we're turning the pelvis more into the leg in that backswing. Now, when you're doing that, and particularly if you do this type of exercise or if you use your foot wedge, you should feel a couple of things. So if I now go back to my ordinary stance and I turn back, I can feel that glute becomes activated, and because I'm sort of keeping my trail leg flexed and I feel like my trail leg is putting up a resistance against the rotation, I feel like I've got an increase in weight pressure underneath my right side, to the point where it's so much easier to open up the hips coming in towards the downswing position. So that's one of the feelings that you really want to have. Now, this is why, there's an element of acceptance in this, but what we're trying to do in the backswing position is we need to turn our shoulders to 90 degrees. Okay, that's what you ideally want to do. It's going to help you with the sequence. So the lower body needs to turn the necessary amount to help you turn there. So for some students of mine with better flexibility and better range of motion around the spine, they might be able to limit their lower body move to sort of 40 degrees and turn the upper body against it for the rest. Some of my students won't be able to do that. They'll have to turn more. But that's irrelevant really, how much you theoretically need to turn. Obviously, the less you need to turn, the better, because again, what we're trying to do is when we start the downswing, if I sort of turn my hips 45 degrees in the backswing, by the time I get to left arm horizontal in the downswing, I need my hips to have turned 45 degrees, because I need my pelvis parallel to target at that point in time. Okay, so obviously if I turn 60 degrees, I'm going to have to do more rotation in transition. So the less theoretically, the better. Okay, the tidier the movement might become, but again, you don't want to do too little to the point where it sacrifices your rotation in the backswing, because then it will ruin your backswing position. So that feeling of that internal hip rotation, that basically means that my lower body, if you like the pelvis, is turning more than the upper part of my leg. Okay, so if I sort of turn my pelvis 45, 50 degrees here, you can see the way the upper part of my leg is moving outwards, but it's not moving as much as where the pelvis is, and that's how you get that state of internal hip rotation. Now, if you are somebody who is limited with flexibility to a degree, what would become acceptable is to turn the foot out, okay? Because if you turn the foot out, you might find that it's easier to trigger more rotation. However, what you need to be careful of is, because I'm meeting quite a lot of golfers now that are more than capable of turning, they just don't know how to. So they're more than capable of turning, but what they're doing is they're starting like this, particularly this trail foot. The problem is if you turn your trail foot out too much and you turn, you're going to really struggle to create that level of resistance to be able to help you in that opening to the downswing. So the way I'd apply this video is a couple of things. First of all, what you want to be doing is getting recognition for the movement. So do something like this, keep your head still and just try and isolate the lower body in a rotational manner till you get that activation. Then in your golf swing, put the club across your shoulders, do the same rotation, keep that trail leg flexed so you can get that same level of activation. And that might take you a little bit of time to get used to. You could use a wedge, a foot wedge to help you out with that sort of feeling, but the general consensus is we need to keep our head still and we need to turn something like so. Just be careful of your foot position, okay? So if I kind of got set up here, that's my feet. So it's almost like my lead foot's flared out, but it's almost like I just let my foot turn in a little bit. And again, the reason for that is because it gives me a more of a platform to feel like I'm turning into, which therefore makes the downswing so much easier. So the moral of this is if you are struggling in the downswing and you're struggling to introduce enough rotation in your downswing, particularly at the start of the downswing, then what I would do is I would pay a little bit more of a closer attention to your backswing position, because there's an increasingly high likelihood that you're not turning correctly in the backswing, which is why you're finding it really hard to open up the hips in the start of the downswing. So you can imagine if I sort of swing back like so, it's going to be easy for me to do this. If I sort of turned like this, your transition is going to be miles off. So keep the head still, work on the turn, be careful of your foot position. You should notice doing that makes results a lot easier.